Good evening. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we meet and we learn from each other on country. I'm coming to you tonight from Gadigal land, where I live, work and write. I pay my sincere respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who might be with us here this evening. Welcome. My name is Rachel Franks. I'm the Coordinator of Scholarship at the State Library of New South Wales, and I would like to welcome you to another episode of History Matters. And tonight we are here for Multilingual Histories. History Matters is a collaboration of the State Library of New South Wales, the Professional Historians Association of New South Wales and ACT, and Oral History New South Wales. It's a terrific series that you can catch up with on the first Wednesday of most months. Tonight, Maria Savvidis will be hosting our speakers and facilitating questions at the end. If you have any questions, please use the chat feature on Zoom. Maria is, of course, well known to many of you. She is a librarian at the State Library of New South Wales, and she is currently president of the Oral History Association. Thanks so much, Maria.
Thank you, Rachel. Good evening, everyone. I want to acknowledge the Wongal and Gadigal people as the traditional custodians of the unceded land where I live and work, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander viewers joining us online tonight. The topic for tonight came about after discussions following one of last year's History Matters, which looked at migration. We know this country has a multilingual oral tradition and history that is many millennia old, with more than 250 Indigenous languages, including some 800 dialects. There are currently 22 Indigenous language centres around Australia for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities to maintain, preserve and promote the diversity of their languages. A third of this country today were also born overseas, so millions of Australians speak hundreds of languages other than English every single day, adding even more richness to the cultural landscape and history of this country. And yet, English is the monolingual mindset that often is the default of society and historical practice. So we really want to look at our multilingual diversity and how that relates to people telling and reclaiming their history and experience in their own words, in their own language, and examples of the ways they're doing that today. I encourage you to submit any questions you think of along the way. We'll have plenty of time at the end to ask our presenters more. But for now, let me begin by introducing our first speaker for tonight, Masako Fukui. Masako is a bilingual journalist, independent writer, and award-winning audio producer. She regularly makes documentaries at ABC's Radio National. She was the audio producer of the Cowra Voices project, which was an audio storytelling app which won the Oral History New South Wales Community History Award last year. In 2019, she co-produced a 5-part podcast for the ABC about multilingual Australia called Tongue Tied and Fluent. Thank you, Masako.
Hello. Hi, everybody. Welcome, and I too would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're all meeting, in my case today, the Camaragal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So I just want to share with you some slides. Here we go. So today we're talking about multilingual history, as Maria has just introduced. And I have been making radio, I come to this as an audio documentary maker. I've been making audio documentaries probably for about 15 years now. 15 years ago, even accents weren't tolerated at the ABC. But being bilingual and bicultural, one of the things that I've always tried to do is to just have language just kind of there as another audio element, just even for texture. Because we hear lots of languages, right, in the street, and we don't walk around asking people to translate them back into English. So I just want to play you a little bit of a program that I made in 2015, which was to commemorate the 70th anniversary of the end of the war in the Pacific. The program was called Kamikaze Daughter, and it was about these teenage boys, 15, 16, 17-year-old boys who were forcibly recruited often into the special attack forces, commonly known as the kamikaze. My father was one of those boys, but he was dead by that time. So I ended up interviewing this ex-kamikaze pilot in Japan who had built his own private museum in his garage to honor the mates that were all killed in the war. So let's just hear this bit of audio.
歌ってください。いや、これはね、歌がこうね、国の平和の礎ぞ、後に続けと先駆けし、帰らぬ君ら、声もなく、清掃と。
So, I think you can hear the emotion in his voice. I think you can hear the history in his voice. And as an audio documentary maker, you know, my sort of main objective is to kind of create those images between the years that tap into history and experience. And I just thought that in the end, I ended up using that whole song in the program, which is almost a minute. And I think that that tells the story of this ex-kamikaze's loss a lot better than if he kind of, you know, if there was some kind of factual exposition and that was translated. Flash forward to 2019, I was commissioned by the ABC, Radio National, or RM, to make a 5-part audio series called Tongue Tied and Fluent about multilingualism in Australia. I certainly think there's more awareness today than there was, you know, 15 years ago, that we're multilingual, not just multicultural. And also, some of you will probably remember that in 2019, it was the International Year of Indigenous Languages. So language diversity was in the spotlight. I made this series with Sheila Pham, who's a Vietnamese Australian. And for our very first recording, we went to Cabramatta. I'm just going to play you a little bit of audio that we recorded there.
Hello, what language are you speaking?
Chinese.
What kind of Chinese?
Or Cantonese.
Cantonese.
Yeah.
Do you speak other languages as well?
Yeah, Vietnamese.
Oh, nói tiếng Việt nghe được hả?
Nói tiếng Việt được.
And
Nói tiếng Quảng được.
Tiếng Quảng. Có tiếng nào nữa không?
Tiếng hả?
Where did you grow up?
Grow up in Cambodia.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. Can you speak Khmer as well?
I can understand it, yeah.
But then you can speak so many different Chinese languages as well.
Yeah. The Teochew, Hainan, Mandarin, Cantonese. Yeah.
And a little bit of Khmer and English. So that's 6 languages.
English, yeah.
What language do you speak at home then?
At home with my husband, Teochew.
So one side is Teochew and the other side is another language?
Language Hainan. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, you don't meet many people who speak Hainam here, I think.
No, not much.
Because the only thing I know about Hainam is the chicken, like chicken Hainam.
Oh, chicken Hainan, right. Yeah.
Yes, we always deteriorate into food when we talk about multiculturalism. But so as you can hear, those are just random women we met in the street, and they were speaking a lot of languages. I think it was more than 6. And this is the thing, whenever we think of languages, we always think of these national languages like Japanese or Greek or Dutch or Indonesian or whatever. But in actual fact, the reality is that most of us are speaking in, well, I shouldn't say most of us, most of the 6,000 or so languages that we have in the world are these small languages that, as you can see, that sit at that bottom of that global language pyramid. And those are just mentioned them was Jeju and Hainan. A lot of indigenous languages fall into that category. Above that, we have these national languages, which we know very well. Above that, we have about 10 or 12 languages, which are these international languages. So like French and Spanish, for example, are UN languages. And on top of that, we have one language, which is the hypercentral language of globalization, which is English. And of course, in Australia, our de facto national language is also English. So often those two facts are used to justify our monolingual mindset. And there's a problem with this, of course, is that, you know, we lose cultures, we lose not just linguistic cultures, but we also seeing everything through a monolingual lens. And I think that's such a shame because, you know, that means that we lose the richness of human experience, seeing something, seeing the world through one language. So that's my spiel for language diversity. Having said all of that, we do want our oral histories and our audio documentaries to be as accessible as possible, which means we do have to translate into English. And for the rest of the time I've got, I just want to talk to you about the ways that we can do that in audio. So probably the best way we could do it is to just have all the language and then have the translation. But obviously that kind of non-interventionist audio documentation approach is not feasible for most of us. So the one that most people use is called the duck and cover, which many of you will probably know. I'll just play you, this is Estonian, I'll just play a little bit of this.
Jahtipukkanen vaata, seal on maja. Yes, baby, that's a house. Look at the two-story house with a red roof and a beautiful chimney. Can you see the yellow flowers growing in front of the house? Kollased lilled kasvavad seal ees.
So as you can see, it's ducks and it's covered by the English. Obviously, if you have a long piece of audio, that bit that's covered by the English is going to be much longer. This is another method, which is where you have the language down the bottom, just running through very faintly, so you can hear both languages. The problem with that, it's fine if it's like a short, 15-second piece like this, but if you've got a long piece of audio, it can get quite annoying. So the one that I like, and that I use the most is what I call the duck and weave. And so that's the same piece of audio. And as you can see, that's a lot more work. I'm not going to play you that audio, but I'm going to play you something else. This is from that Kamikaze Daughter program, and it's a duck and weave method.
20年の8月の15日の12時、天皇陛下がな、放送があったんです、国民に。
On August 15th, 1945, at noon, an announcement from the emperor to the Japanese people was broadcast. The emperor said that in order to prevent any more Japanese casualties, he had accepted the terms of the Potsdam Declaration. The war was over. I was meant to fly out the next day, so that's why I survived. I've been asked many, many times how I felt then. I have to say, I felt like I failed to die. It was like coming second in a race. I was so disappointed and ashamed. I didn't want to survive.
So I think you get the picture. So what I wanted to do there was to maintain as much of the aesthetics of the old man, Mr. Kawano speaking. So, I think the tempo and the cadence of his speech is maintained, and then just having the English language over it doesn't kind of destroy that richness of his voice. In this instance, I asked this Japanese, Australian actor, who has a Japanese accent, but obviously he's a much younger man. The voice isn't quite as doesn't have that rich texture of an older man. Obviously, when you do translations like this and you kind of dub over it in this way, you have all these choices. Some people say you don't even need to match the gender. You don't even need to have somebody who has the same language background, so the accent doesn't matter. I mean, these are all aesthetic questions, and then there are no hard and fast rules. I want to play you this little piece of audio. It's an American one, but this was the best one that I could find. If you happen to be bilingual and you can do this, I think this is fantastic. So I won't say anything more, I'll just play it for you.
He's not going anywhere. After a long wait, it becomes clear that the pastor is not going to show up today. It's then that the situation for the visiting foreigner takes a surprise turn.
The service was supposed to start at 10:30, and the pastor is not here. 他应该是10点半到，是吗？10点半就上礼拜了。Okay, so the people in the church are sitting waiting for the service, and they've asked me if I will preach the sermon. This is not something I was expecting when I arrived. 但是我可能讲得不好。看一看，咱这白话都记。Okay, here's an 83-year-old lady who is asking me to preach the sermon.
So I think you get the idea. So what he's doing there is called code switching. So he's switching from one language to the next continually. I can do that a little bit, but like I'm quite bilingual. My bilingual skills are quite high, but I don't think I could do that. But I think it's fantastic because it feels so alive. It feels like you're right there. And so that, again, going back to that idea of trying to create an audio experience that puts you, it immerses you in that experience, I think this works really well. And the last piece of audio I want to play for you, again, it's American, but I think it's really powerful. And I'll just warn you that it's quite difficult listening. So many of you may know this story about the yellow rain. So I'll just give you a quick background. So after the Vietnam War, some Hmong people in Laos experienced what they thought was chemical weapons falling from the sky, and they called it yellow rain. It was killing plants, it was actually killing people. In the 80s, some American scientists went to investigate this phenomenon, and they concluded that it wasn't actually chemical weapons, but it was actually maybe bee poo or something to do with bee pollen. So, and you'll hear that in this audio that I'm going to play. And Radiolab, which is a national NPR American podcast, went to investigate this story in, I think, 2012 or something. And this is the audio from them. So what you'll hear is the first-hand witness who's speaking in Hmong, and then you'll hear his niece who's doing the translation.
I saw with my own eyes the bee pollen on the leaves leading to holes. With my own eyes, I saw pollen that could kill grass, could kill leaves, could kill trees.
But he himself is not clear whether it's the bee stuff or whether it's other stuff, because there was so much stuff coming down from the sky.
真正嘛要你啥的要的红色的因保龄的那些人别养高呢，但是一两别好听。You know that there were chemicals being used against the Hmong in the mountains of Laos. Whether this is the chemicals from the bombs or yellow rain, chemicals were being used. It feels to him like this is a semantic debate, and it feels like there's a sad lack of justice. That the word of a man who survived this thing must be pitted against a professor from Harvard who's read these accounts.
But as far as I can tell, your uncle didn't see the bee pollen fall. Your uncle didn't see a plane. All of this is hearsay.
My uncle says for the last 20 years, he didn't know that anybody was interested in the deaths of the Hmong people. He agreed to do this interview because you were interested. You know, what happened to the Hmong happened, and the world has been uninterested for the last 20 years. He agreed because you were interested. That the story would be heard and that the Hmong deaths would be documented and recognized. That's why he agreed to the interview. That the Hmong heart is broken, that our leaders have been silenced, and what we know has been questioned again and again is not a surprise to him or to me. I agreed to the interview for the same reason. That Radiolab was interested in the Hmong story, that they were interested in documenting the deaths that happened. There was so much that was not told. Everybody knows that chemical warfare was being used. Well, how do you create bombs if not with chemicals? We can play the semantics game. We can. But I'm not interested. My uncle is not interested. We have lost too much heart and too many people in the process. I think the interview is done.
Okay, so apologies for being difficult listening, but I think it's really powerful. And so what's happening here is that the translator, the niece, steps out of her role and becomes another informant, because she has a vested interest in this, in how this narrative is told. And I think we really need to ask ourselves in these language exchanges, who holds the power? You know, because I teach audio documentary making to students, and I always say, whenever you hold the microphone, you know, you have a lot of power. But when we're also converting the discourse into our language, then I think that's a power that we really need to be careful with. And this is why sometimes we might need to include the translator or the interpreter as another character in the story, like Radio Lab has done here, because they're also an integral part of documented history, I think. But as we know, a lot of academics and journalists don't even acknowledge translators by name. And I think that's a serious omission and perhaps injustice. Finally, I just want to share with you a funny story. Many, many years ago, so in 1992, I was working in Tokyo, and I was working as a researcher and translator for the New York Times Tokyo Bureau. And with David Sanger, who was the bureau chief at the time, we went down to Kyushu, which is the southernmost island in Japan, to interview this 91-year-old traveling bard. So once upon a time, there were these traveling bards who used to wander around the country with their lute, singing songs and telling stories. And he was the last one in Japan. So we went all the way down to this tiny little town in Kyushu, little shack outside of town. And when I got there, I realized that I couldn't understand a word he was saying, because he was speaking in this dialect that I had never heard of. And, you know, like, I think there were about 6 or 7 really smart people in the New York Times Tokyo Bureau, but none of us even realized, none of us even thought of this. And this is like going back to that language pyramid, you know, many people do speak in those small languages that we don't even know. So what happened? What happened was, because the New York Times was coming to this little town, the local, I think it was just some local town administrator and the local newspaper followed us around because they were so excited. And luckily they were kind of peering in the door of this hut. So we got them to translate into Japanese, which I translated into English. So it was a 3-way process. Obviously that language exchange was not documented in this newspaper story. And I think that's kind of a serious omission. I have no idea what happened with this dialect. Maybe it's gone now, which would be a real shame. But this is an example of me botching something up, but also an example of needing to be language aware in our storytelling. So that's it. Thank you very much. And I just thought I'd offer you some food, even though it's digital, but it's always nice to share food. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Masako. I loved hearing all those different examples and can't wait to ask you more information, more questions, so we can find out even more after our next presenters, who I will introduce right now. Rhiannon Wright is a proud Burrabarongal woman from the Darug Nation, who is the daughter of Leanne Mulgo Watson and granddaughter of Darug elder Auntie Edna Watson. Rhiannon has grown up on Darug country and spent her life learning her culture, traditions and language through her mother and grandmother, in turn passing on and sharing this knowledge to her daughter Lyra, keeping the unbroken chain of culture that has extended for thousands of years alive and strong through generations. Rhiannon is currently a part of Darug Custodian Aboriginal Corporation and the Aboriginal Education Officer at Windsor South Public School, where she very proudly shares and connects culture, language and knowledge with the students and wider community. Our other presenter is Jasmine Seymour, who is a member of the Darug Custodian Aboriginal Corporation. Jasmine is a descendant of Maria Locke, a prominent Burrabarongal woman in early colonial Sydney, and the daughter of renowned elder Yarramundi. Jasmine is a Darug language activist and primary school teacher in the Hawkesbury area of New South Wales, who's recently completed a Master of Indigenous Language Education at Sydney Uni. She's also an artist and children's book author, including Baby Business and Kui Mitiga. And she works with linoprint, watercolours and ink. Her work is inspired by the Sydney rock engravings and is a response to the stories they still hold and tell every day. Welcome, Jasmine and Rhiannon.
Warami, Budjari Nami Darug Nurula. Hello, welcome. Good to see you on Darug country. Nalu Warami Inyini Darug Nurugu. We welcome you to Darug country. We would also like to pay our deepest respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders, past, present, and emerging. My name is Rhiannon Wright. I'm the granddaughter of Darug elder Auntie Edna Watson. I'm here tonight with Jasmine Seymour, who is both an artist and an educator. We both proudly belong to the Burruburrungal clan of the Darug Nation, whose country embraces the land, rivers and sea, from the Blue Mountains to the ocean, from Hawkesbury in the north and down as far as Appin in the south.
Hi, so we're here today to talk to you a little bit about Darug language and the reclamation process that it is undergoing at the moment. And so I'm just going to share a screen with you. So Warami and Budjari Nawunya, good to see you. I'm going to introduce you to my family because you might be looking at me thinking, this isn't an Aboriginal woman, but the story of Sydney is the story of, you know, me and Rhiannon. We are the descendants of the Aboriginal people that lived here. As you can see from this picture, this is my family. The first picture is, of course, an iconic picture of Maria Locke that Leanne Tobin has made. And next to her is my 2x great-grandmother, Hannah Locke, and she lived out at the McGrath Hill pub. She lived just behind there. And the next picture is my grandmother, Laurel Seymour. And then it is my mother and my father. Now, my mother is a Dutch woman. Yet I've never been to Holland. I don't speak any Dutch. I don't know very many of my family. I have been born and raised in the Hawkesbury, where my family, my Darug family, have always lived. Down the bottom, you will see Hannah and George Morley. This my grandmother's grandmother on the Jurubin, the Hawkesbury River. Their son with my nana's brothers and sisters, and then me and my dad. And in the next picture, you'll see.
So this is my family. In the photo with the 4 people, it's my daughter, myself, my mother, and my grandmother. So we're very lucky to have the 4 generations in our family, and especially to have one of, like, my grandmother is the Darug elder, one of the Darug elders for this area. So I've been lucky enough to grow up and learn my culture and language and our traditions through her. So in our family, and in most Aboriginal families, knowledge is passed down through generations.
So Rhiannon and I are part of a big joint process by the Darug groups in Western Sydney who are creating their dictionary at the moment. And part of that, of course, is decolonising language. So you're taking all the European stuff out of the language and we're getting it back to how we know it should sound. And it's a very exciting time. And so, as you see in the next slide, you know, Australia, of course, is a multilingual nation. It should be a multilingual nation. We should be able to speak in all the Aboriginal languages, or the Australian languages is how they're commonly known. Australian language, this is 250 of them, but there was probably 500. And you're right, many of them have different dialects. And for the language here in Sydney, you know, we know that the language of the Sydney Basin is exactly the same. All the records say that, you know, the language of Sydney is the same until it gets to the Hawkesbury. And so then there's talk about the inland dialect, and yet that dialect is really only maybe one sound that's added to that with a few other words. And what we know about Aboriginal languages is that all Aboriginal languages share 75% of the same content words. And so when you're on the edges of these places, it is very common for there to be lots of shared language between different language nations. And this map, you know, even though it's wonderful and it shows the diversity of people, it also causes so many problems, because these maps are you know, they make boundaries, and they make people become very possessive of those boundaries. And in Sydney, you know, where we're still learning about our past, and we're still learning about taking all that Europeanness out of our language, it can sometimes cause lots of problems with, you know, sort of issues over dialect and who owns what. And yet we know dialects are really just a political thing, you know. It really has nothing to do with actually what the language is. And the language is, for the whole of the Sydney Basin area, the Darug language. What it is called by other people is a different matter. Mm-hmm. So we are also part of the Jarubin, Mapping the Jarubin, this project that we did with Grace Karskens. And this was extraordinary. So I'm just going to go on to that slide. As you can see here, this is a story map. And we were involved with Grace in mapping the names of the Aboriginal names of places along the Hawkesbury River. Grace found a word list in the library, the State Library, that Reverend McGarvey, one of the first ministers out at Ebenezer, had recorded with some of the Aboriginal people who were there. And what we were able to do was find out, or really, you know, reawaken the place to us. And it was extraordinary, because we, you know, language is never dead, it is never lost. And this map has really allowed us to bring it back, you know.
To give back to country.
Exactly, exactly. And it's extraordinary. And so for Aboriginal geography in a place like this, you know, it's not just about plants and trees and those sort of geographical features. For us, you know, this map has shown us that it is, the river is a body. It actually has arms and legs and mouth, and it is living and breathing. It is an entity. And not only that, it connects us to other nations where we really see that it is part of this bigger story of our version of the rainbow serpent. In one of the places along the bends, the name is Durumbulua, which means the path of the rainbow. And many places along this incredible river have these really deep spiritual connections. And it's been so exciting to be a part of.
It has been, especially because it's such a great opportunity to show non-Aboriginal people in the area how significant like the river is, and how much culture and language there still is. Because a lot of people think that there's not that it's not there, but that some of it has been, or a lot of it has been lost due to colonization. But it's been amazing, because this map has really shown, brought it back to life and really connected and shown people that what's really there underneath everything.
So we really encourage you to check it out. It's being hosted on the Dictionary of Sydney, and it really is incredible. It's such an exciting thing to be a part of. So, of course, when you're talking about Darug language, or the language of Sydney, you cannot talk about it without talking about Badagarang and William Dawes. Badagarang is our first language hero. Without her, we wouldn't have any of the language that we have or what we know about Sydney. The extraordinary thing for me about Badagarang's record is that in many of the other language nations around us, their records come from, you know, the missions, and some of those things say things like, you know, God save the little children. But our language, our story is about first contact, and it's about the violence. And you see this in the discourse between Badagarang and William Dawes. And as you can see from this slide, you know, where it says, a white man beat us. it's so powerful, you know, and we're so grateful for this record because it's sort of, you know, it's the most untouched record we have of the language. No English has really touched it, really, other than William Dawes's translation. And so we know that it's quite, it's very good, because then the next record we have is Magave. Then the next that we have is from Matthews. And then we have our language heroes that we've had in community. You know, we've had extraordinary people like Rhiannon's grandmother, who has done a huge amount of work with language. And then going on to Richard Green, who's been extraordinary, and Jacinta Tobin, and the many, many other language champions that have really worked with language in Sydney. And now we're coming to a point where we're ready to make our own, you know, dictionary.
Which is absolutely amazing, because it wasn't that long ago that Aboriginal people were too scared to speak their language, or it was shameful to speak Aboriginal language, your own, like Aboriginal language. So it's very exciting, and we're making a dictionary, we're getting the language together, and people are proud to be speaking the language.
And I think the thing that people don't understand about Australian languages is that we, you know, they're not as hard as you think they are. They are complex, and I'm not trying to minimize, you know, what they are. And yet when you have a few keys and you understand some of the things about them, you have the keys in, and it's so exciting. I think, you know, language is the biggest act still against Indigenous people that is occurring today. When you don't have your language, you don't have your culture. And this is used as a weapon of lateral violence for many, many Aboriginal people, you know. And so our lack of understanding about how our languages work is really causing a lot of issues for us. And I think, you know, at the moment there is this real interest and energy about learning languages, and it is really exciting to be a part of. So the Darug language, of course, is part of the Pamanungan languages, which is all the area in yellow. So we all share something in common. And as I said, you know, 75% of the content of the language of one area is the same as that around you. So it is exciting. So for Darug, you know, we know our sounds are like this. We have this NG sound, nga. We have a j, like a ch, but without the air, ch, j. We have ny, like onion. The trill is like if you say butter very fast, butter, butter, butter. The like pirate, and the DH, that is like the that. So, you know, our greeting, Nyini Bujiri, are you good? Ewan, yes. Ngaya Bujiri, I am good. I think, you know, one of the things that people don't understand about our Aboriginal languages is that we have this sort of, with our consonants, some of the sounds are the same. The P and the B, the T and the D, the K and the G, they are the same sound, except we just don't have the air when we speak, or it's a mix of in between these two. And so Parramatta, Padagarang, Badagarang, Parramatta, Burramatta, they are the same words. Guri guri, it is the same thing. And yet this can cause lots of issues with people over saying that belongs to me, that word is mine. And yet we know, when you know some of this stuff, that removes those issues. I would just like to share with you now, you know, an example of the sort of things we are doing when we're teaching community and teaching in school, because I'm a school teacher. So this little picture book that I made, it says, Ngandi, who is that? And once you understand a little bit of the language or the meaning, you very quickly pick up what is being said. Di Kirui. Where is Kirui? Dingaladi, there she is. Duraniwa, in the tree. Warami Kirui. Ngan, Di, Di buru. Wa buru. Dingaladi bamurua. Warami buru. There he is on the grass. Hello, buru. Nyan di. Who this? Di magura. Wa magura. Dingaladi barua. Warami magura. Nyan di maribara. Wa maribara. Dingaladi jurabanwa. Warami bara. Nyan di mariung. Wa mariung. Dingaladi birangwa. Warami mariung. And so for Australian languages, you know, the historical records that we have are all about country, community, and culture. And so when you're creating resources about your language, they all turn into these beautiful things which express country and culture and kinship. And so, you know, for an Indigenous person, when you are given that back, it can be one of the most powerful things that you ever experience. It is an extraordinary moment for Darug language at the moment, and we're just so excited to be a part of it.
It's very exciting. I think it's extraordinary, especially because we both work in schools, to have our children singing in the language or speaking the language in schools, because it wasn't that long ago that you weren't allowed to do that, and to have our children singing and speaking the language is absolutely amazing.
So we'll leave you tonight on that, and we hope that you enjoyed our presentation, and thank you for being with us. Yanu.
Thank you so much, Jasmine and Rhiannon. Thank you. Did you want to play your song?
Yeah, I can if you like.
Yeah, go for it. I really want to hear it.
All right. So this is a song that we use in our primary school, and this is a song that I wrote called "Where Is Mother? Look for Mother," and it shows you where she is, and then it says, "Good to see you on country." So I hope you enjoy it. But it doesn't seem to be playing for me.
We have a comment saying you might have to be in presenter mode.
All right, started to play.
Ding-a-la-ding-arawa, ding-a-la-ding-arawa, bujarinami nuruwa, bujarinami nuruwa, wa-woo-be-younga, wa-woo-be-younga, na-be-younga-goo, na-be-younga-goo, ding-a-la-dee-goo-yang-wa, ding-a-la-dee-goo-yang-wa, bujarinami nuruwa, bujarinami nuruwa, wa-woo-juraman, wa-woo-juraman, na-juramingu, na-juramingu, ding-a-la-dee-durani-wa, ding-a-la-dee-durani-wa, bujarinami nuruwa, bujarinami nuruwa, wa-woo-babana, wa-woo-babana, na-babanagu, na-babanagu, ding-a-la-dee-baduwa, ding-a-la-dee-baduwa, bujarinami nuruwa, bujarinami nuruwa, Bujarinami Nuwa.
And that is the end of that.
Fantastic. Thank you. Glad I got to hear it. We might get Masako to turn on her camera too so we can all have a discussion. Are you there? Yay, there you are. Hi. I guess the thread that runs across both of your presentations was really language as identity, and language is a way, speaking in language is a way for us to connect with our culture and our history and our ancestors. I was wondering if you could expand a little bit about that from your own personal experience through your work and just in your everyday life. Don't know who wants to go first.
Oh, I'd be happy to hear from Rhiannon and Jasmine if really keen to hear.
Yeah, I think that what I want to say is, you know, I'm a primary school teacher, and to see, you know, Indigenous kids in Sydney have never experienced learning Aboriginal language before, because maybe they've had it in little bits, but it hasn't been anything where they've had a grammar, where they're being able to converse in language and create sentences and to actually hear it. And for them to sit down and to learn some of this thing, the pride that they see, that they feel and they exhibit, and that and they want to be good at it as well. I think that's extraordinary. You know, they desperately want to be good at it, and you see them really stepping up into being leaders and showing other kids, I can do this, this is mine. And that effect on their literacy, I think, is just amazing. And that's why I think it is really one of the biggest violences still against us, that it is not, you know, just the simple knowledge of how they work, that's not known for us. It is desperately sad, and it really needs to change. I think, you know, so that has been profoundly important to me in this last year.
Yeah. So when we were doing the 5-part series for Radio National, we, you know, because we didn't really know, as you know, Sheila and I both being settlers here, we didn't really want to kind of do anything about Indigenous languages. But the last program that we made, we just felt that we had to go there. It was like this thing, you know, like if we live in this continent and we're talking about language and diversity, then it's like you can't not talk about the diversity of Indigenous languages. And we went and spoke to Ray Ingray. I don't know if you know him, but and he just took us for a walk and just, you know, like, and gave us, Sheila and I both, you know, like with Asians, but we just didn't have that understanding of the connection between land and culture and family and all of, you know, kinship and all of that, that for the first time I kind of understood.
Yeah.
And for me, like growing up, one of the interesting things that I kind of didn't say today, but one of the interesting things about language in Australia is not only do we have a monolingual mindset, but there are certain languages that are okay. For example, French is always okay. You have a French accent, you know, and you can say a few words in French, that's fine. But Chinese is not, you know, a lot of Asian languages aren't. It's like, so there is this term called prestige languages. So those prestige languages tend to be European languages, French, German, maybe a little bit of Spanish. But, you know, it's that, it's not just about language, but it's also about that language pyramid and about the flexibility of that sometimes prestige languages come to the top. Interestingly, at the moment, Japanese is a prestige language, or becoming a prestige language, and I think that's because Japanese popular culture is so popular among young Australians, whereas it certainly wasn't when I was growing up. So in terms of valuing our language, you know, the way people perceive our languages as well is also really interesting, I think. If you're French, you know, you probably, like, you know, you have that, you value your language and culture. But if you're Indonesian or something, you know, you want to kind of give up as a kid.
Yeah.
And I think that you know, in 2019, when we made this program, when we made our series, we just learned so much from Indigenous Australians trying to reclaim their language.
Mm.
And what the other thing I wanted to say was what's really interesting is, and you just said it as well, that there's little words that you just grew up with that you didn't even know where they came from.
Yeah.
You know, but they were language, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's kind of interesting to kind of know that and know the context of where those words come from as you learn your language and reclaim your language.
Yeah, I think it's you know, I also think like I work at a school where we have a really high proportion of Indian students, you know, from Nepalese and Punjabi, and well, it's quite a mixed bag, and for them, because they are learning Darug alongside our Indigenous students, and for them, you know, it's so exciting for them to learn something other than just English, because they see Australian languages or my language and they go, oh, my language does that. And that's really interesting. There's, you know, you start to see the things that we have in common, and I think that is really powerful. And I do think language is the path to reconciliation for Australia. I really, really do. You know, once we get that right, I think, you know, it's probably the most powerful act of reconciliation there is.
But I think we do also live in a time, I saw an article just a couple of days ago about, you know, how we in New South Wales, we're actually particularly bad about valuing language, and that at schools we're just not teaching languages anymore, and a lot of people are dropping languages because, you know, it's not good for their HSA, HR or whatever. At the university level, you know, humanities, obviously, people not learning languages. So we're kind of, I think we've have to, it's not just this monolingual mindset, but we are fighting the whole institutions and policies. Yeah. Haven't got any questions. No one has questions?
I have lots of questions, but very happy for you to talk about whatever you like. I was just going to ask, do you think we're ready? The abstract we, do you think Australia is ready for a multilingual mindset? Because I think we know, we can see it in everyday life that practically it is happening, but at that other sort of level, are they ready to start bringing in and really celebrating other languages? You mentioned even 20 years ago on the ABC, other languages were not common or welcome, and there's been that sort of shift. Do you think we're ready now? About control and power, really?
So that whole debate, especially in the education sector, about valuing of language is always, that argument is always about, well, you know, it's really good for your brain, it's really good for getting a job, you know, do Chinese because it's going to be good. Like there was a period when everyone wanted to do Japanese because it'll get you a job in tourism or something. Like it's so transactional, the way we look at languages. And what I think we need to learn, especially from, you know, what Rhiannon and Jasmine are doing, is this idea that it's just valuable. It's just valuable.
It should just be everywhere.
It's just value. Like we don't ever sort of talk about, you know, like we don't debate whether it's good to read books or not. We just assume that it's good to read books or play sport or something. So why is language always this transactional thing? It has to lead to something. But that seems to be the way we look at language education, which is really, I think, the downfall of, because, you know, you can't, it's not measurable in that way. It's measurable in other ways. It just makes better humans, you know. I mean, I kind of had to fight my parents growing up because they always spoke to me in Japanese, but I had both parents who were Japanese. So that was what I had to deal with. But as an adult, I went to Japan and relearned Japanese. If I hadn't have done that, I don't think I'd speak Japanese quite as well. So somewhere along the line, I had learned to value my language and culture, but that's so easily lost. So in Australia, it's a fact that in 3 generations, migrants lose their language. And that's really sad.
That was one of my questions, is how do we hold on to language through generations and keep passing it down and celebrating it when society's not set up for that.
No.
And language is a living thing too.
Unfortunately, a lot of this falls on mothers. So in our research, and it's always mothers, even if the mother is from a monolingual English-speaking background and she marries into a Lebanese family and the father is Lebanese, the mother does the language maintenance. So it's kind of a feminist issue as well. So a lot of it does fall on parents, the mother, being the mother. A lot of it falls on sort of community language schools. They do a really good job, but they're so under-resourced. Yeah, I don't really know what the answer is. I think we just have to value language.
See, I've been sort of wondering whether the problem is that, you know, when we've been teaching language, because you know, you're just sort of learning one language, but you don't understand how language works. So I'm wondering whether the answer might be that we learn something about linguistics. And I don't think there's any harm in that, in learning about a little bit about linguistics, because then you have the meta language, you understand how English works as well, because you learn through this thing that you can then apply to other things. And I really wonder about that, you know, because linguistics is sort of like this scary thing that nobody wants to go near. But when you understand it, you understand so much about how language works.
About people.
It's fascinating for people when they dip their toes into it. But when you're sitting in a room and you're just learning some, you know, verbs and single vocab, that's not actually that interesting. So I really, yeah, I'm really interested in that.
And
I would have loved some linguistics in school.
It would be really good. I mean, if we could just learn, like, a little bit of language is fine. People think, you know, to learn a language, you've got to be able to speak it fluently, but that's not the case. Like, you know, in my lifetime, I've learned Indonesian and Italian and Spanish and all kinds of languages, and I'd have to say I can't speak most of them, but I can still understand a little bit, and I think that's fine. And I really like this idea. I think what you're doing, Rhiannon, is kind of teaching kids words and being kind of excited by just words is a start. And maybe that's where we start. I don't know. But I think it is very difficult, because we kind of, you know, today kids have so many things that they're so much pressure on them to do so many things, that to kind of try and build language learning into sort of their educational curriculum and trying to teach kids language at home is just like another burden. It feels like another job for parents, and it's just, yeah, I think I wish we could find ways to support that.
I feel like with our students, I try and get them interested in the language and understanding how special it is that they're actually speaking it and learning it, that they have that, that they can actually do it. I always talk to our students and say, like, it wasn't that long ago we weren't allowed to. It is so amazing that you can actually speak and use language in a school. Like, it's, yeah, I always try and drive that home and get them interested and realizing how special it is and how special they are for being involved with it and learning it.
We've got 1 minute left, and I really just wanted to plug Jerome. If you're in the library next, please come to the galleries and look at this incredible exhibition curated by my colleague Marika in Indigenous engagement. You can download this guide online from our website if you can't make it to the library, and you'll see more of Rhiannon and Jasmine in the exhibition because they're all through it and it's incredible. Our next History Matters is actually in August, and our theme for August will be saltwater histories. So it's really looking at environmental history and the saltwater zones and the Southern Ocean. So we're not here in July, but we'll be back in August. From my mother tongue, I just want to say, ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ. Καλό βράδυ σας και θα σε δούμε ξανά. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hello, Yanni.